This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. All right, welcome back to another episode of Transparency, everyone. We are fortunately joined today by Helena LaCroix. Not LaCroix. What's your Twitter handle? Something like that.
It is
Something
pronounced
LaCroix.
LaCroix. It's a stupid story. So basically, I was in college. People wanted me to make a Twitter. I didn't think I was going to use it, and I was drinking a LaCroix, so I just made it LaCroix. LaCroix was taken as a username, so I just put like a bejumblement of letters at the end of it, and then now I just have a lot of followers and haven't changed it. So,
Excellent.
however, I'm not drinking a LaCroix right now. I'm drinking a Waterloo, so
Ooh.
not living up to my name.
I'm drinking a Shasta Club soda, so not even nearly as classy.
Yeah, I just got a hot chocolate. I'm just kind of ready to settle in here.
Break the mold. So we are hoping to talk about kind of the cultural aspect of transgenderism or transgender ideology, and more like the social justice, gender, like the kind of what we commonly know in academic circles as like queer theory, but as it's applied in more like online youth realms, more commonly known as basically like social justice theory or a social justice framework, and how that's probably the primary driver in so much youth transition today, or even 20-something transition today. And Helena knows that stuff inside and out, so she has joined us to shed light. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself for the people who don't know you, which I doubt is anybody, but introduce yourself.
Well, if anyone has not seen me rabidly go off on the timeline yet, I'm a detransitioned woman. I'm 23, and I started identifying as trans when I was 15, after getting very involved in like Tumblr fandoms. And with that came obviously the social justice stuff, which I believe played just a huge part in my trans identity, an eventual decision to transition. When I was 18, I went on testosterone, and I was on testosterone for about 17 months before I desisted. And after I desisted, I kind of identified as non-binary for a few months. And then eventually I just said, I'm a girl. So yeah, that's the short story. That's the short version of my story.
It seems like for a lot of people, the non-binary identity is either kind of like sometimes an on-ramp or an off-ramp from full-on trans identification.
So. Yeah, and I think I know we'll definitely get into this more, but I think the reason for that is because when you're immersed in these social justice spaces, like that's a very strict, almost like moral code with your peers that basically says that if you are privileged, then you're responsible for all of this pain and suffering and wrongdoing in the world. And for someone like me, who at the time was a cis, straight, white girl from like a upper middle class upbringing, I felt a lot of guilt about all of this privilege that I had. And obviously you can't change your race, you can't change your sexuality, you can't change where your family comes from. But one thing that you can change is your pronouns. So it's really easy for girls who are in the situation, or boys too. I think especially boys who are young, they're not socially like adept, and they're faced with this very strict kind of unforgiving moral framework. It's so easy to just say, I'm going to try going by they, them pronouns. And then you get this kind of like positive feedback loop. So we'll probably talk more about that, but that's my opinion on that.
Well, we can even like talk about it now, even as like what I've noticed, or like slowly over the last few years kind of clued into, is it's almost like if you don't choose to identify as non-binary, it's almost like you're actively choosing to be an oppressor, like to participate in these oppressive structures where you're on an upper ledge. And it's almost like there's it's so much farther beyond peer pressure than like that you feel compelled to adapt a trans identification in some way. And like you're saying, this is often like people in your kind of demographic range, white people, typically middle or upper class, where you like have this kind of this guilt and this lack of kind of an existing cultural kind of community to identify yourself with, and so it has this twofold appeal, is that it comes with this kind of sense of, you know, personal differentiation and a community to belong to, as well as getting you out of the oppressive class you exist in if you're cis and straight. So
no, yeah, exactly. And I think like teenagers are already in a state where they're so vulnerable to social rejection. And so when you've already been rejected a lot of the times just for being more introverted or more nerdy or having autism or being gay, anything like that, when you've already kind of been rejected from your in real life social circles, whether that's your community or your school, and then you seek refuge from that in these online spaces, and then you're hit with, once again, we will reject you unless you change this, or unless you fit into this some kind of oppressed group in some way. Not that it's explicit, but it's very much like, you know, the cis straight white people are the ones who are constantly the butts of very negative jokes. You'll get told like, you have no right to speak on this. You have no right to be depressed or struggle with anything because you're so privileged. And so, I mean, I think that's an incredible incentive.
yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of a lot of cultural forces and incentives to adapting it. And then it seems like, and I don't think this was your experience as far as like when you started testosterone, but something that I've seen that seems to be the case in a lot of that kind of understanding is that transition is almost seen as something that you do to demonstrate how committed you are to the trans moral code. It's not so much that you feel like there's a problem with your body that you need to fix, but more like but by transitioning, it's like you're demonstrating, you know, a commitment to this moral code. Is that something that you saw?
I do relate to that, and I think that you can have, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive with having body image issues. I think that, I mean, it's kind of like eating disorders, you know, where it's like someone with an eating disorder is going to have genuine like torturous angst over their body and disliking their body, but at the same time, there's also like the socially contagious communal aspect where it's like you want to be the sickest, you want to be going the furthest, you want to be showing your commitment. So I think that does exist almost in like a direct parallel in some of these young FTM or non-binary circles.
We talked about the on-ramp, and I just wonder if you could kind of walk us through a little bit about what that on-ramp looked like for you. Like, how old were you and where did you first encounter some of those ideas?
Yeah. So I was 15, and to give a little bit of context, so when I was in middle school, I had like a decent little circle of friends. I wasn't like a total social outcast. But then sometime around 8th grade and then into 9th grade, there wasn't a huge falling out or anything with anybody, but my friendships just seemed to kind of like drift away. I really felt like I couldn't keep up with the changing like social relational complexity that my peers were going through, like starting to enter relationships, starting to use social media, and kind of with young girls, there's a lot of just competition on a very subtle social level that I just was not keeping up with. So I became really isolated. And in my 9th grade year, my freshman year of high school, I became super isolated. I just stopped going to school. My mom let me stay home from school because I was just so depressed. I was self-harming all the time. I was like really alone. And I started using Tumblr. And I found Tumblr during this part of my life. It was really the summer before my freshman year of high school. I found Tumblr because I was really interested in like classic rock artists, which there was no one else, no other girls that I knew who were interested in that. And I was looking on the internet one day, and then I just found this website where it would be like the hashtag insert band name, like it would be like the hashtag Led Zeppelin, or hashtag the Beatles, or hashtag Elvis, and I could just scroll endlessly and just see like all this stuff coming out. So I was like, wow, oh my god. And so that was like immediately really called to me. And so I just pretty much from the get-go started using Tumblr a lot, hours and hours and hours a day. And anyone who's been on Tumblr knows that pretty much as soon as you get involved in any kind of community, you see like the social justice kind of posts popping up. So in between everything you have with whatever you're interested in, your fandom, you'll see posts just all over the place talking about social justice stuff all the time. And a lot of the times it's very like emotionally charged. It's not just, some kind of educational post. It's like, like, white people need to shut up. I don't want to like just really emotionally charged stuff. And so, yeah, I remember seeing this kind of stuff. And at first I had one friend in real life at this point, and he was a gay boy using Tumblr as well. And I remember we would be like calling each other late at night and making fun of like these social justice warriors, because we just thought it was kind of ridiculous. And then I had a falling out with that friend, and we kind of stopped talking. So then I was just left to Tumblr. And I remember just always having this kind of like deep resentment of like, why are you talking such shit about cis people? Like, what's wrong with being cis? Like, what's wrong with not wanting to transition or be trans or think I'm a boy? There's nothing weird about that. Like, I had this intense resentment of that. But over time, that resentment, I guess, turned into like, okay, fine. I guess I need to not be cis. Like a subconscious process. This wasn't like a decision to like, I'm not going to be cis anymore. But I think it was a subconscious process of just giving in and being like, look, I don't want to feel this resentment. I don't want to feel like I'm constantly the butt of every joke. I don't want to feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells, because if I say anything, a billion people are going to come at me because I'm cis and I have no right to talk. So I just I remember there was a few days where I kind of mulled over it. And then I was like, you know what? Maybe they, them pronouns do feel better than she, her pronouns. I've never felt connected to being a girl anyway. What does that even mean? So yeah, I made my little post being like, I'm just trying out they, them pronouns to see how it feels. And then obviously immediately everyone was like, oh, that's so awesome. That's great. We'll call you they, them. We accept you, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, cool. And it just kind of kept going from there, where I would like acclimate to the they, them pronouns, not doing any of this in real life. This was all on Tumblr. But then again, my mind was all on Tumblr too. I wasn't really connecting with the outside world at all. I would acclimate to the they, them pronouns. And then I would be like, okay, well, you know what? I think I'm actually a demigirl. That's my gender identity. And then I would kind of acclimate to that. People would be like, yay, so proud of you. And then I would say, you know what? Maybe I'm agender. And then people would be like, yay, yay, congratulations. And then I would acclimate to that. And then I'd be like, well, maybe my pronouns are Zer. I remember I used that at one point. And again, everybody is like super happy about it. And yeah, it's just, it took me from feeling like, oh, well, I've been rejected in real life, and now I'm getting rejected again, and I'm really angry about it. But I don't have the confidence to just continue being myself. So I'm going to change myself. And then when I changed myself, there was all of this social reward.
That's the point that I was picking up on in your story, right? Is every time you announced a change in identity, you were getting the reward of the approval and the support. And it makes me wonder, like, I mean, that really reinforces a constant changing of identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I could see a person getting, especially if a person is really isolated, this, every time you change your identity, you're getting that kind of hit of that reward. It does seem to, I mean, it makes sense to me anyway, that would lend itself to people kind of experimenting with a lot of different identities and constantly shifting identity.
Yeah. And another thing is that obviously when you're first learning about all this gender identity, pronoun stuff, it seems like this massive world of like stuff that you've never considered. And so I think that when in your real life you feel like people don't accept you, but then in this alternate reality of Tumblr, you feel like people accepted you for they, them, you start to think like, could I push this further? Like, could I test to see how much people accept me based on how, intricate my pronouns and gender become? Like, I'm sure you guys have seen this kind of online where it's like people write in their bios or in their card or whatever, they'll be like, my pronouns change depending on blah, 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 blah. And my gender identity is different depending on blah, blah, blah. I am a girl during the full moon and I am an androgyne, agender, blah, blah, blah during when it rains. Like people kind of do that. And I think that at least for me, because I didn't go that far, but I did kind of, I used the Zer pronouns and like stuff like that. I think that it's kind of like you're feeling like acceptance for the first time, and that it's conditional, but you're so hungry for that feeling of acceptance that you kind of keep changing things and making them more complicated and kind of like digging the hole even further to test if people will continue accepting you. And they always do, because it's not real acceptance, it's conditional. And they just continue cheering you on. And it's so easy to just like get your perception warped that way.
Do you think there is some sort of kind of social currency in that kind of worldview where you're essentially kind of separating yourself further and further from like mainstream understandings? Like, is that where the praise is coming from, that you're kind of distancing yourself more and more from what like cishet society?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's there on like the political level where in the worldview, it's like cis heteronormative post-colonialist white society is like this evil, horrible institution that's killing people and blah, 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 blah. And then so what you want to do in response to that is to separate yourself. And in this particular worldview, a lot of that is done through identity and through language. And so you want to separate yourself from that, cis heteronormative white hegemony or whatever they want to call it. So there's that. But then I think there's also just the kind of normal teenage tendency for some teenagers to want to be part of like an alternative group, an alternative lifestyle. So I think there's that too. And I remember feeling that way when I was in high school, when I had to go to school and interact with the normies. I would just kind of cope with the fact that I wasn't fitting in by being like, these idiots, they don't even understand that we live in a like cis hetero white patriarchy, blah, blah, blah. And that was just kind of my way of like not having to really come to terms with the fact that I didn't have many friends, or that I wasn't fitting in with the normal people. I think that's pretty normal for certain teenagers, but there's definitely that at play too.
Yeah, I did that as well. Like I kind of framed when I was a teenager, like had this kind of goth grunge identity, and I, used that to basically somehow mean that I was superior to the normies. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's a pretty normal, certainly for the odd nerdy teenagers to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you attended one of those, like a school where a lot of this social justice and queer theory stuff is being taught. Was that reinforced? The stuff that you're picking up online, was that being reinforced through the school?
No, actually, I think I was a little bit before that. And my school district, I think, not that it was conservative, but it was like a more Republican area. So that just, I don't think was a factor. So yeah, I didn't see anything like that at school. If anything, I was kind of challenged at school. I remember there was a few kind of events that happened in the news where, there's like the kind of like leftist narrative, or like the I don't know what you call it, but just that narrative that interprets everything through the lens of like social justice. And then there's, the kind of more like normal people narrative. So I remember I had this English teacher who, there was if you remember like the Charlie Hebdo attack in like 2015 maybe.
And there's than that. Oh, sorry, go on.
maybe even earlier than that. I don't really remember, but I just remember that the kind of like leftist, for lack of a better word, narrative was, you know, that almost, if I'm remembering it correctly, it was like, well, if they wouldn't have made that cartoon, then they wouldn't have been attacked for it. And that it was like the attackers were striking back against like racism and Islamophobia. And so I had this English teacher who he wrote something and he put it on like his door about how like, it was like I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was like a pretty like measured take. It was like, it was factoring in that kind of stuff. It was also factoring in like, you know, that it's you know, free speech is important, freedom of expression and blah blah blah. We can't allow violence against people for expressing something that is offensive to another group of people, blah blah blah. But me and one of my only friends at the time, we just went rabid. We like attacked this guy. We were like, he's racist. We wrote stuff on Post-it notes and put it on top of his thing that he wrote on his door, calling him racist and stuff. So I definitely feel like I and my small friend group, who were all on Tumblr, super like social justice crazy, we were very much alone in that. And that the rest of the school was not aware that any of that was happening.
And now that would almost be like a New York Times level take, what you guys had.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's like very normal. And I think that in a lot of areas, just the average high school student would have agreed with us, which is pretty scary to me, because I think that I think it's so much better to have an adolescence without that nonsense. I'm sad that I had an adolescence that was like so drenched in that. And just to think that so many high schoolers are growing up in that now, it makes me sad.
That's one thing that's been really eye-opening for me over this last couple of years, because I would always consider myself fairly leftist, moderate leftist. And I think what's eye-opening for me is it's almost like we have two completely separate parallel societies, depending on whether you're on the left or on the right, which is becoming more and more polarized, and completely different media for each camp.
Yeah.
And so the information that we're receiving is really kind of dictated and tailored to which camp you're in. And so it's so, and in this activism, you know, we're interacting with a lot of different kinds of people of different political positions. And it's almost creepy how people can live in a completely different universe with a completely different way of thinking. And that's, we call it echo chambers, I guess, right? That.
Yeah, but it's like even more than that, because it's like there's like a different canon of how events took place depending on what side you're on. And it's so difficult because I have my interpretation of how various events took place. But I've noticed that like talking to someone who has the opposite version of events, it's like impossible to have a conversation, because you were literally, it's almost like, you know, like the Berenstein Bears universe thing, where it's like in one universe it's Berenstein Bears, and then I don't know, have you heard of this? Yeah. And the other one is Berenstein Bears, and it's like just different things happen in different universes. That's how it feels right now with just like perception of events that take place, and it's really crazy. It's very unhealthy.
And on the left, with the social justice being what it is, the left, I think, is under the impression that unless you believe in a particular social justice model, you're therefore a bigot.
Yeah.
And I think what's been really eye-opening for me and helpful to hear from people on the right and how they would describe social justice, it's not that they don't agree that racism or discrimination happens, that they just have a different model of understanding it and solving it. And that's been really helpful for me to learn, right? Because now half of the world isn't frightening anymore, right? That there are reasonable and intelligent people on both sides who just have a very different model of understanding the problem and how to solve it.
Yeah, I agree.
And it is also interesting that we continue to talk about it in right and left in like this traditional political compass framework, when it's really like what we now call the left is very quite illiberal and quite the opposite of what we kind of understood the left to be and what liberalism was understood to be. So even using that old like dichotomous language of left and right, it doesn't really reflect where things currently are. It's another thing to grapple with.
I tweeted the other day that I think the real divide, instead of right versus left, is people who still heed the institutions and respect the institutions. So, for example, I know that there's always kind of like the use of the word democracy. Not that I'm anti-democracy, but like, you know, they'll say that like, oh, if you question certain narratives, then you are anti-democracy. Or if you question certain narratives, then you're anti-science. Or if you question certain narratives, then you are anti, you know, this or that institution. And then on the other hand, or, you know, if you question certain narratives, then you're anti-journalist. Or you know,
it's very childish thinking.
Yeah, it really is. And another example is kind of how like the Washington Post has democracy dies in darkness, as if like they're kind of like the institution that is keeping the democracy from dying in darkness. And a lot of people do fall for that, and people still, I think, on the left predominantly don't question the media and they don't question the government, which is very different from how it used to be. They don't question the intelligence agencies. They don't question, they don't really understand what science is. Like they think science is just like, oh, these smart people find the truth and then they tell us the truth, which is not what science is. And then on the other hand, you have the people who almost by default don't trust an institution. If an institution is saying something, then that means that by default needs to be questioned. And, you know, people who just do not trust the media, they don't trust the government, they don't trust the science, they don't trust any of the bureaucrats. So I think that's more of the divide that we're seeing now, because it's like you have a lot of people who are kind of on the latter side, where they don't trust the institutions, where politically they're more traditionally left wing. But when you look at what camp they end up falling into, it ends up being kind of like the Republican kind of like, they don't want to vote for Democrats, basically, camp. So I think that trust for the institutions has a lot more to do with where we fall politically right now than any actual political philosophical thing.
Yeah, I don't think many people on the left realize how much our media is controlled and manipulated.
Yeah.
And that's fairly new. I mean,
I honestly think this is going to wake the trans issue is going to wake a lot of people up out of their blissful slumber of what's going on and what's being propagated by mainstream institutions. You know, when the chips fall on the transition of children, like I don't think that people will be you know, blissfully complicit any longer. Sorry, I'm steering us back to the trans thing inadvertently.
Yeah.
No, it's a good point. I think like the trans issue is so interesting, because I think it's one of those issues where you don't have to be like an educated, scientifically minded expert to understand why it's wrong to transition a child. I think that you can have just like the average person off the street with a intuition and a gut can know that that's not right, and that's going to really end up hurting a lot of these young people. But we live in this moment where we're gaslit into not trusting our own eyes, not trusting our intuition. And at some point, I think people are going to like, I'm not sure, maybe there are two scenarios. One where people do end up thinking that it goes too far, they trust their intuition, or another one where I think people can get into a kind of situation where they lie to themselves so much, and to admit the gravity of the lie that they've been telling themselves is so humiliating that they just can't open their eyes to it until far after the fact.
And I think so much, like if we look at the parents of children who are being transitioned, it almost seems like we've got the two extremes of this just in the parents. Like, so the parents who are transitioning their children, like that. So so obviously, like, we've all had to grapple with our decision to transition and kind of face that head on and wherever we landed with that. But and it is humiliating on certain levels that you felt for certain things along the way. But imagine that perspective from the parents who are transitioning their children, who have allowed their teenage children to transition, and so they're going to fight tooth and nail to maintain this lie because they even have more invested in it than the individuals who have transitioned themselves. And then on the flip side of that, the people fighting the hardest to wake everybody up to it are the parents who are resisting their children transitioning. So I think in the parents we see the most extreme of the current moment.
That's a good point. Good observation.
Speaking of parents, how did your parents respond to your identity when you were identifying as non-binary?
So they definitely weren't about it. I didn't tell them about any of the non-binary stuff. I pretty much kept it to myself, to my small group of friends, and to Tumblr until a few months before I turned 18 and went on testosterone. So my parents weren't really in the loop on that. And then when I told them, sorry, I just got a notification, it distracted me. When I told them, it was kind of like, listen, I'm a trans boy. My name is trans name. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm starting testosterone when I turn 18. So that just kind of off the bat started a conflict. I think very understandably, because I told my mom at first. I never really had like a direct conversation with my dad about it, but I told my mom, and yeah, very understandably, she reacted pretty shocked. She was not very like supportive, I guess. I don't know what I expect of her. I think her response was pretty reasonable. But then like from then on, it was just a little bit kind of like dysfunctional. Like I think my relationship with my family just is a little bit dysfunctional. We were never close. And so we just didn't talk about it for months, and then talked about it again shortly before I turned 18, turned into a huge fight, like screaming match in the middle of Kroger, which is a grocery store for anyone who doesn't live in my area.
We have Fred Meyer over here, which sells Kroger products. So I think it's the same store. We just call it Fred Meyer over here.
I think
really relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, I think Jewel Osco in Chicago is also run by Kroger, but I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe even Publix. I'm not sure. There's a lot of stores that are owned by Kroger, but now I'm getting really distracted.
Sorry, that was my sidetrack. Carry
on. Where was I? Oh yeah. So then didn't talk about it again until well, no. Like the night before I went and got testosterone, which my parents didn't know I was doing. We had a conversation, and I said, look, like we're moving me into school like in 3 or 4 days, because I was starting college. And I've already told the school that I'm trans and that I'm a boy. And so they have me as all my boy information in their files. So it's going to be really awkward. It's going to make you look like an asshole if you don't call me a boy in front of all the people at school. So my mom was like, okay, fine, I'll call you a boy. And then I got my testosterone. She didn't know about it. And then I came back, and then a few days later, we moved me into school, and my mom ended up calling me she at some point, which obviously made me flip out. I was really upset. And then maybe like a week later, we just got into like a massive fight and didn't talk for months afterwards. So my mom definitely didn't handle it well. I think that she was right in being kind of shocked at first, but I do think that the conversations we had and the fights we had, they took just like a really dark turn, and I don't think that she treated me very nicely. So yeah, that was a difficult time in my life. And my dad was more just kind of like uninvolved. He was like, if you want to be called that, whatever. And he just kind of went along with it, which I don't think either of them really handled it in a very loving way. And even after the fact, like, we're not very close. So yeah.
I'd love to know about your experience at the gender clinic.
Oh yeah.
Did they do an assessment, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I went to Planned Parenthood and they did. So I talked to a social worker for maybe 20 minutes, and I went back after I detransitioned and I got my records from them. And so in this 20-minute social worker interview, she asked me maybe like 10 questions, and I have all the questions and the notes she wrote down for each of my answers. I actually have copies of that, and it's just pretty crazy. Like they weren't very in-depth questions, to put it mildly. It was just kind of like, how long have you identified as trans? Why do you want to start hormones? And my answers were like, well, I've always been trans, but I only knew about it 3 years ago. I only found the words for it 3 years ago. And I want to start testosterone so that I can look more masculine. Like those are my answers, and just really not very in depth. And then she said at the end of this short interview, she said she would go talk to the nurse practitioner and see if they would want to start me on testosterone. The nurse practitioner agreed. But when they came back into the room to talk to me, they said that since I had come such a long way, because I drove from Ohio to Chicago, because there wasn't informed consent in my area. And I don't know, sometimes I question myself and think like, did I just miss an informed consent clinic? Why did I drive all the way to Chicago? But I did. And so she said that since I had driven such a long way and I seemed so sure that they wouldn't do any further assessment and they wouldn't take any blood work and they wouldn't have me drive back up for a follow-up, they would just give me my first injection at that very appointment. So yeah, there wasn't very much assessment. And yeah.
So you also had a really interesting experience at that clinic, because as I recall, you were telling Sasha and Stella on Gender a Wider Lens that you basically told them, oh, I've got big boobs and big hips, and therefore I need extra testosterone. And they're like, oh yeah, totally. Much. That sounds legit.
Literally, like, I shit you not. That is what happened. So yeah, usually they start you off on like a dose, like, from what I've heard from other women who have been on testosterone, usually 25 milligrams is kind of where you get started out. I've heard from a much smaller group of people that 50 milligrams is where they started out. But usually, like, it's somewhere down there. And so I originally was getting prescribed 25 milligrams, and this is a week. And I said, like, I expressed that I was concerned that it wasn't going to have any effect on me because I feel like I produce more estrogen because I have big hips, not even big hips, big thighs and big boobs, which is like crazy to me. Every time I tell this story, I'm like, why did she listen to me? Like, you can look at me. I don't have abnormally large boobs or thighs. What the fuck? But yeah, basically she was just kind of like, okay, so do you want to go up to like 50 milligrams? And I was like, I might need it to be higher. And so she was like, okay, so where do you want to start at? And I was just like, what's the highest? And she said, usually we don't go over 100 milligrams. And then so I was like, can we do that? And she agreed to it. And so that's what she prescribed me.
Wow. I mean, just to put that,
and I have the records and everything. Like, I could
and just to put that in perspective, I'm on 65 every week.
Yeah,
I've been for years. So to start
I started at 25 and was on that for 6 years, and have been on 50 for the last 4. It's interesting when you talk about the kind of mental turmoil, the emotional roller coaster that you went on. It makes a lot of sense when you realize how much testosterone was flooded into your system.
With no gradual build up to it. It was just like, one day I had normal female levels of testosterone, and the next day I was injecting 100 milligrams into my flesh.
It's likely about 50 times what your body was used to. Somewhere between like 30 to 50, I would say, times.
Yeah. Yeah. Super. Like, I feel like that woman probably subscribed to a kind of like, just give trans people whatever they want. They come in and they ask for 100 milligrams of testosterone. Don't question anything. Don't think that this is an 18-year-old girl. Don't just prescribe whatever they want, which I know some of these kind of like clinicians subscribe to that worldview. But yeah, super irresponsible.
Wow. One thing that I've realized as well, so I kind of got wind of the social justice element and like kind of like transitioning to be trans process around 2017. You're saying that this, your experience of this was, and when I encountered that 2017, the people I encountered it from were already acting like I was a weirdo for not realizing that, of course, you transition to be trans, and of course, it's wrong to be cis. And so in 2017, I was already weird for not knowing that, right? So it obviously been going on for at least a few years. So you're saying you encountered it around 2015. How long do you think, like, when you sounds like you got into Tumblr around 2015, and this was already the main, this was already the understanding?
I started using Tumblr 2012, and I started identifying as trans. This is always hard for me to think back to what years these were, but I think I started identifying as trans in 2013, if that's correct. When I was 15, I'm 23 now. I think that was around 2013, 14, something like that.
About a year then. About a year on Tumblr before it had an impact like that on your identity.
Yeah. I think the first year was a lot of just, they, them pronouns and agender and kind of just like non-committal gender identities. But then the more like the gender identity started becoming a part of my personality and my identity, like I stopped seeing myself as like a girl. I saw myself as like a trans person, like whatever my identity ended up being, as long as it was a trans person, that was correct. So yeah, that ended up kind of crossing paths with my body image issues and my feeling of not fitting in. And I just became, over time, after about a year, convinced that my problem is that I'm a trans boy, and if I just had a more masculine body, then I could look like a man and I could fit in with boys somehow better than I do with girls. I don't know what my rationale was for that. There wasn't a lot of rationale, but yeah, that's what I thought.
So it sounds like for you, you thought transitioning would solve a social problem for you.
Yeah, social and body image. Like I literally thought, like when I would picture myself, because I would always kind of fantasize about the future. A lot of future fantasy was going on. I would fantasize about, walking down the streets of New York, and I'm this like tall, lanky guy, which is like completely not my body type. I'm a little over 5'3". I tend to be a little bit like, on the curvy side. I don't have like an androgynous physique at all. So like, I don't know what I was thinking, that I thought that I would become like 6 foot tall and like lanky muscular, like shredded. Like, I really don't know what I was thinking, but that was kind of my like future fantasy that I would engage in all the time. So
do you think it had a lot to do with basically you're spending so much time online, where you are just essentially whatever you want to project? And I think if you're spending so much time online, kind of disconnected from your physical reality, I think it's easy to kind of start fantasizing about a future that's kind of along the same lines of whatever you're fantasizing about your kind of avatar being, essentially.
No, exactly. That's 100% correct. Like, completely disconnected from my body. I really hated my body. I just had the worst like body image issues, eating disorder. I absolutely loathed my body. I think that was my number one just like mental health issue, was like I couldn't even like look people in the eye because I just hated how I looked so much. I would just hide myself. I wouldn't socialize. So yeah, really hated my body. But then so disassociated from that body, like disowned that body, and just started spending so much time online, where I was thinking about and talking about fictional characters and actors and art of my favorite fictional characters, projecting myself onto fictional characters and looking at art of these fictional characters in this specific body type. I was really like into kind of like the tall, lanky, skinny guy body type. And so I think just years of that, just constantly looking at this imagery, constantly looking at this content, just rewired my brain to think that by the magic of transition and testosterone, I was going to become this like cute, lanky, skinny Tumblr boy.
Which is not that hard to understand, especially since you're kind of your brain and self-perception, like that time of your life in adolescence, like your latter ends of your teenage years, you're kind of, forming a sense of self. And if that's happening in that confine, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you're not really forming a sense of self in the natural way where you're going out and having experiences and you're learning things and you're, taking risks and experiencing consequences. You're forming your identity through scrolling past images and ideas and posts all the time, which can really fill your head with anything.
At the point where you ended up going to the clinic, if it weren't for the informed consent clinics, if you had gone to a clinic that wasn't doing informed consent, knowing your frame of mind at that point where you drove that distance to go to a clinic, is there anything it's hard to know for certain, but can you think of anything that a clinician could have done for you at that point that might have intercepted this process or just helped you even reflect on it differently?
Man, I always just think that the only thing that really would have helped me is to just have like a trusting, loving relationship with an adult, because I just didn't really have that. And I think that what I needed was guidance and kind of like acceptance, but in a way that, steers me in the right direction. And I think that if there was a clinician that could kind of approach me from a compassionate yet realistic point of view and really tried to like build a relationship with me, which is hard because these clinicians are seeing so many people and like they're not my mom, they're not my parents, so that's hard. But I think that maybe that would have helped if some clinician could have gotten me to trust them, because I think that's what I really needed, was guidance and someone to trust. But other than that, I'm not sure if there's anything that someone could have said or a particular type of therapy that would have helped or anything like that.
And it would have taken a long time because because the culture that you were already inundated in tells you that the healthcare profession is just full of transphobes who are trying to stop you from accessing transition. And so you're already going into it thinking, I have to get around this person who's going to try to get me to not do this, and they're wrong, and they're cis, and they're a transphobe, and I'm right. And it's like a moral crusade is essentially what I'm not answering for you. I'm like, this is what I've kind of picked up and how people talk about this online is like, it is like a moral, like a righteous crusade to fight against anything that's kind of going to put the brakes on transition.
Dude, I found a video a while back, maybe like over a year ago. I might be able to still find it on my old laptop, but it was a video I made that I posted on Tumblr after my first testosterone appointment, where I talked about how disgusting it was that they were gatekeeping me by making me talk to this social worker for 20 minutes. And I just go on and on about it, like, this is what trans people have to face every day. They're scrutinizing my identity. They're literally subjecting whether or not I exist to the whims of some cishet white woman, like just going off about that. So it's like the fact that I was in that state of mind, like there's literally, I think people, especially parents, kind of have this idea that it's like, oh, well, if I just find a therapist and send my kid to the therapist in 3 months, they'll be just like they were before again. And it's like, no, like these kids are really indoctrinated, and it's not like a rational belief system. It's completely emotion based. And it's like, there's so many layers to it that there's nothing that a clinician can do in the span of a few appointments that can help, especially if there is the alternative of informed consent, where I just go in there and pay them money and they give me my hormones.
And that narrative isn't new. I mean, that whole just suspicion and distrust of any clinicians, I remember that being how people were talking in the community 20 years ago.
And I mean, there's some right to it, you know? It's like, if you really feel like this is what you need, and it's, you know, it's part of your identity, and it's almost like you see it's like it's part of your soul, like it's who you are, and you have to go appeal to some stranger in a white coat who's going to judge you. Like, I really understand that. I think that there's like a lot of reasons to be skeptical of clinicians, but I just think that I just wasn't I don't think my skepticism of a clinician was based in any like true reality. I think it was just, like you said, a moral crusade. Like, I don't think they could have done anything other than, I guess, like bring my hormones out on like a velvet pillow and like get on their knees and hand me the hormones. Anything short of that, I think I would have deemed transphobic gatekeeping.
This particular social justice movement too is very skeptical of objective reality. Like it's very, the emphasis is on lived experience, and the lived experience and the knowledge of oppressed people has priority over all else. And you know, so the way this narrative goes is, you know, I know who I am as an individual more, and that information is more valuable and superior knowledge to anything the clinician knows, right? And we've taken that to such an extreme. Well, I shouldn't say we, because I don't think I've had a hand in that, and I don't think either of you have. But as a culture, I guess is what I mean by we, is we've done that to such a degree that we've thrown all the science out the window, and rather than building on the science that was happening in the 80s and 90s, we've just completely tossed that out.
Yeah. Well, because I think in this worldview, like they kind of see the clinicians as coming from this long-standing institution of cis heteropatriarchy. Like, it's like that's literally a representative of the cis heteropatriarchy, and so they're going to have a lot of skepticism against that, especially since they feel like they have to appeal to this person. Because if you're one of these people, like truly you think that science and rationality and hierarchy, like all of this is like a product of this, cis heteropatriarchy that you disdain. So any clinician is going to, there's nothing they can do really. Like, there's just so much mental protection against any clinician actually making a connection with that person, which isn't like entirely wrong. Like, I know we talk about this worldview as if it's like completely crazy, and it is, but I don't think it's entirely wrong, because I think, people kind of pick up on the fact that a lot of the times when you go to a doctor or when you go to a therapist, they don't really help you. Especially in America, you give them a bunch of money and they don't really help you. I know I've had that experience a lot. I'm sure many people have had that experience. And so I think maybe this, in a way, is kind of a response to that, where it's just like a very convoluted approach to explaining that. Like, why is this institution so ossified and so corrupted and so like not helpful to most people?
And because we've devalued the professionals to such a degree that they're really just vending machines at this point of medication, right? That we don't really value their experience or the science at all. There's so little help for people. Like, it's like, okay, here's your hormones, and then you're just left to your own devices to figure the rest out. And every trans person I've ever known has said that, right? That it's like, yes, we got the hormones, we got what we wanted, but now we're having to negotiate our identity with the rest of the world, and that is very, very, very difficult. And we don't often talk as a trans population about the trauma of transition. It's stressful and traumatizing. The things that I have seen, like bad surgical outcomes. When I was down in Texas for my surgery, one of the trans guys, who was just a young guy, like in his 20s, he almost died. He almost bled to death on his floor. It was another trans man that found him. So, I mean, these things are happening and we've just normalized this. This is just, we're so focused on thing that we want and this belief that it's going to make our lives so much better. And for some people, it does. So I'm not going to take that off the table. But the amount of trauma that we just normalize and don't even register as trauma is unbelievable.
Sorry, my cat. And I mean, I think part of that is a result of, like you said, like the professionals, like there's been a change from professionals in these fields, like these experts being true experts like they were in the 80s and 90s, and not just for gender medicine, for really everything in medicine, but gender medicine is the concrete example here, where back in the 80s and 90s, like you had these clinicians like, you know, Blanchard and Zucker, who they were true experts. They had experience and like just a true unique calling to the field. But now it's like we've, you know, gotten rid of all of those people and we've completely disregarded the value that someone like that brings. And we've just made it, you know, like a vending machine, a transaction. And so the consequence of that is that you don't have involved, passionate, knowledgeable clinicians that are true experts coming into contact with this unique population that has very unique needs and concerns. You just have these completely uneducated people who they're on like a moral high trip, thinking that they're doing this amazing thing by handing out hormones to everyone who walks through the door. And that really, at the end of the day, does a huge disservice to the people who are actually being treated, because you can't get around it. Like it's a very unique population. And, you know, just the act of transitioning, of being trans, of having surgeries and going on, you know, cross-sex hormones, that presents really unique challenges that need expertise. And when we deprive people of that, these are the consequences. So that's another thing. It's like people call us transphobic and say that we hate trans people or that I hate trans people or whatever. And it's like, no, like I think that people who transition deserve a lot better. Like nobody deserves what people are going through right now. It's just like, it's crazy to me that we've gotten rid of the people who are true experts and who actually care in favor of these randos.
It's considered trans friendly to just to act like these interventions are completely mundane and not invasive at all, that are perfectly healthy and normal and not a big deal. It's like you're not reconstructing genitals to, you know, cosmetically appear the opposite sex's genitals. Like we talk about it like it's Botox, like it's just this routine thing, and that's so detrimental to the people that it's supposed to be, you know, helping.
100%. Like whether it's someone like me or it's someone who is not going to regret and try to reverse their transition. Like, I don't think that, you know, Ken Zucker or Ray Blanchard would have prescribed me 100 milligrams of testosterone, which made me go fucking insane and be in the psych ward twice. Like, I don't think that would have happened with someone who actually was an expert and who actually deeply cared about what they were doing. But then you have these people who they're not experts, they don't know what they're doing, and they don't really care. They're in it for themselves, for their own sense of moral superiority. And then they make these massive mistakes, like completely irresponsible mistakes, and it ends up really hurting people.
So what was the off-ramp for you? How did you end up sort of finding yourself out of this?
Yeah, so remember how I said that my life was like 90% fantasy when I was in high school? And I had this fantasy of, you know, like being this like handsome, lanky, tall guy walking through New York, puffing on a cigarette, very aesthetic. And then when I actually did transition, that didn't happen. Like none of the things I fantasized about that I knew were going to be my life once I started testosterone and transition, none of those things happened at all. It was just kind of like hell on earth, to be honest. I became so much more dysfunctional and unhappy. And I think like after about a year or so, I was just like, listen, like internally, I was just kind of like, what the fuck is this? I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but sure. I was just like,
I do it all the time.
Okay, cool. I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is not what I paid for, basically. Like, I paid for being a cute boy and having an awesome life and this fantasy in my head. And that's not what I got. So just slowly, I was like, I started getting this feeling of like, I wish I didn't have to be trans.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was like writing on Reddit about this too, asking like, do any of you feel like you wish you weren't trans? And, you know, people be like, yeah, we feel that all the time. But, you know, that's just like it's because society's transphobic.
It's
And so like,
internalized
okay.
transphobia.
Yeah, internalized transphobia. And so I would just kind of do that. And then I would get I would get like rationalized back into it. And that kind of went on for a while. But then eventually, like, I just really started missing like simple little things that I felt like I couldn't do as a trans man, like playing with makeup or wearing leggings. I was always trying to wear like men's loungewear and it just didn't fit my body. And I was like, fuck it. Like, I just want to wear leggings. But I was like, oh, I can't wear leggings if I'm a man. Stupid. But yeah, so I just started having like just feelings like that. And then eventually the real turning point was that my ex, we were in a relationship at the time, but who was also a trans man at the time, made a video for me that was like a montage of pictures of us from basically the beginning of our relationship, which was like 2 days after I started testosterone. So in the beginning of the video, I look like me. And then I can just see myself like slightly like changing, like looking more unhappy, looking more sick, looking more like disheveled, looking just not like me, developing like the little Justin Bieber mustache. You know, and I was just looking at this kind of progression and I was like, oh my God, this is not what I wanted. What the fuck have I done to myself, to my life? And I like started putting that together with like, it's not just the fact that my appearance changed. It's like, I was supposed to have this amazing trans life. And instead I've gotten like psych hospitalizations and I feel like I'm crawling out of my skin all the time and I feel like a complete fucking psycho. Yeah, and so that was just the moment that it like the realization like finally concretely dawned on me that this was like a huge mistake. And following that was very, very difficult. I felt like I ruined my life forever, which is like crazy to think about now because I'm fine now. But yeah, at the time, I thought I was like the only person that this had ever happened to and that I was just uniquely stupid and crazy. Yeah.
I've heard that from people who, when the motivation was that social justice motivation, and then they start to actually resemble the opposite sex, especially if they happen to be white as well. It's like, now, okay, now I appear like a straight white cis dude. How does that work with my social justice framework? So it actually is, for some people, they don't realize that transformation is going to happen. People are going to perceive you as the opposite sex at some point, not trans. So if the whole point was to be like a social justice warrior and be trans, that disappears after a certain point once that physical ambiguity phase ends. And they end up sometimes being, a bald, potbelly straight dude. And so I hear quite a few people over the years saying, well, that didn't really occur to me, and I want to appear more androgynous. So they end up going off testosterone for a while and then back on it, and they try to just sort of skirt that line between appearing female or appearing male, because for them the whole point was appearing trans, not appearing the opposite sex.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And for me, I still generally subscribe to the social justice worldview, but pretty much from the time that I started testosterone, I kind of got off the internet. I wasn't really using any social media because I was just too enveloped in the shit show that my life became to really be posting on social media. And so I kind of like got disengaged from the social justice worldview very slowly. So by the time I was kind of like really doubting my transition, I wasn't really thinking along political lines that much anymore. When I decided to detransition, the political aspect kind of came back, where it's like, I didn't want to just be a cis het girl. I needed to be non-binary first. But yeah, I don't think I ever passed well enough to kind of see like a man and then feel bad about that. I passed in the sense that, like, if I wore the right clothes and did my hair the right way and carried myself the right way, people would generally, like 90% of the time, call me he. But it was such an act that I had to put on that it really didn't feel like I became a man. It felt like I'm trying so hard to look like a man, like nobody noticed that I'm not actually a man, that kind of thing. So I never really kind of identified with like, oh, I fit in as a man now. So maybe that's why that wasn't really a thing for me.
It's interesting, like when we have these conversations, and obviously the three of us kind of in the online gender critical realm, and with the interacting with the feminists and whatnot on this issue, who are often under the impression that girls who transition are doing so to flee male oppression and to basically shrug off the everything that comes with like misogyny and whatnot, and they're basically betraying the womanhood, and when really the opposite is actually what's going on in these girls' minds, is that they're basically further entrenching themselves into a victimhood identification that's almost like the concept is you're almost like lowering yourself below cis women, because you're not thinking in this kind of male female paradigm anymore. It's a cis trans paradigm, and therefore if you're trans you are then lower than the cis women, and this is something that a lot of the feminists don't understand when they're trying to combat this issue. It's like you're missing the very fundamental point that's happening here.
They don't understand that cis women are considered very privileged in these circles. Like, that's not the oppressed group, that's the oppressor group. Because you also have to realize that, like, this is mostly like girls talking. And so, like, most of these communities are like almost all female. And so there's kind of like this competition, right, of like who can be the most oppressed. That's how you get your social status. And if you're all females, there can either be the cis females and everything else. So you don't want to be like the cis females. So yeah, cis females are considered very privileged, especially there's also the fact that they're considered privileged in comparison to trans women. So trans women are obviously the most oppressed people who have ever lived on this earth. Like, forget about anything else. Trans women are all basically Jesus being nailed to the cross. And it's horrible.
Because not only are they trans, they're also lesbians. Imagine the bad luck. It's terrible.
Yeah, they're trans and they're lesbians. And yeah, these cis women just won't let them in. And it's just causing murder and death. So it's very horrible. Cis women are very horrible for this. So yeah, there's I can see how you would interpret that as like, well, there's so much negative messaging about cis women, so they want to escape that. I really understand that, but I don't think it's kind of the traditional like feminist idea of male female. I don't think that a lot of girls, especially the straight ones, I think it might be different for lesbians, but especially the straight ones, I really don't think that they're coming at it from the point of view of, well, I feel like I have to be feminine and I don't feel like I can be masculine without facing consequences. So I'm going to escape that by being trans. I really don't think that that's the mindset that most of them are going through.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of, again, the gender critics say is like, it's okay to be gender nonconforming, or it's okay to be gay, without understanding that most of the people today seeking transition are actually quite gender conforming and are and they're heterosexual, and they're insecure about that because there's nothing worse than being cis and straight, and so they're transing the cis head away, and I think it's so important that people realize that that the point of transition is not to flee societal oppression, it's to gain societal oppression. And yeah.
And I think, again, like, this is where I have a lot of sympathy for some parents with this, because it's like, I think sometimes they will face some backlash from gender criticals when they talk about, you know, how anxious it makes them to see their daughters suddenly adopt like this more androgynous masculine presentation along with their gender identity. And, you know, sometimes feminists, like, understandably, they'll be like, well, what's wrong with your daughter cutting her hair? She should be allowed to cut her hair. But it's like, she's not cutting her hair because that's how she feels like she wants to look just as a person in a vacuum. Like, I wasn't cutting my hair because I didn't like having long hair. I cut my hair because I wanted to signify that I was trans. And so I think, like, parents pick up on this, obviously, because they've had their pretty gender conforming daughter their whole lives. Not gender, like, these concepts are so like oversimplified. Like, they've had this daughter who never in her life has expressed like discomfort with being a girl, has liked putting on dresses or whatever every now and then. Like, there's never been like a significant distress with these gendered appearances and roles. And now all of a sudden she's rejecting it all. And so I think parents pick up on the fact that, like, okay, like, this is not something 100% natural. And it's actually very unsettling that this drastic personality change has just occurred at the drop of a hat. So
and it usually coincides with like depression and withdrawing from the family and being alone or online all the time. It's
I almost think that, like, I think for a lot of girls, like, it's less about the gender roles themselves, and it's more about just like assuaging different like psychological issues. Like, for example, one thing that I think is pretty common is wanting to be more invisible. So not wanting to be feminine, not because you prefer masculine things, but because you don't want to be pretty, you don't want to stand out, you just kind of want to be invisible and avoid attention. And not even like, you know, negative attention or harassment. Just like, you know, you don't want people seeing you walk into a room and think, oh, wow, she's pretty. You just want to be ignored.
You want to neutralize yourself?
Yeah, kind of neutralizing yourself, or like, there's all sorts of things that, like, this kind of like radical appearance change, like, there's so many functions that can serve in someone's life. I think that's a huge oversimplification to kind of look at it so literally, that like, oh, this girl cut her hair and is wearing basketball shorts now. That's because she wants to look more masculine because she hates femininity. I think that's a huge oversimplification.
Because I have 4 teenagers, I do, especially the girls, I monitor their social media accounts quite closely. And there's a TikTok trend that was going around about a year or 2 ago. Maybe it's still going around, but it was a series of TikTok videos of prepubescent to, I guess some of them were teens, girls mostly, kind of unloading, well, inventing different mental health problems. Like, it was like a competition between who has it the hardest, right? So my dad does this and my mom does this and I've got, you know, OCD, or, you know, and most of it seemed to be completely fabricated, but it's this competition of whose life is worse than the other teenage girls. It's very bizarre, but it ties into what you're saying, that the whole point is to be as low on the pecking order as possible, because that has social currency these days because of how we're seeing social justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, tying in with that, something that Sasha Yad has talked about before is how a lot of these girls who end up being drawn to this kind of thing, whether it's gender identity or this kind of like mental illness stuff that you talked about, which I completely can corroborate that. She's talked about how a lot of these girls, they seem to be like very whatever the opposite of assertive is, like very agreeable, like people pleasing type of people, where they don't have kind of the strength to really say what they want to say or speak up, and they kind of feel like they're burdens, or like they're not justified in getting any kind of attention for anything. And then so I think one of the reasons that this like really calls to them is because you have this competition for who's the most justified in feeling the way that they do. So if this girl is depressed or something, she can't just say, well, I'm sad because of XYZ. She has to justify it by saying, I'm sad because I'm oppressed and because I have DID and because my parents are abusive. And like, I think there's just like a tendency of these girls who are really struggling with just being their own selves in the world. I think that needs to be developed as you grow up. I think that's pretty normal. And just as you experience the world, you develop your voice. But this kind of like ideology, it just really, it becomes a crutch for that.
It's like it tells them that they're not worthy of empathy or attention for who they already are, what they're actually struggling with. And so you have to up the ante so that you're being terribly abused, or you've got such and such diagnoses, and that means that you're actually worthy of empathy and attention and love and support.
And that is part of the reason why they flip out so hard when you question their identities, because to them it's not, you're not questioning the actual logic of why you identify as a boy or non-binary. You're questioning whether or not they deserve empathy. You're questioning whether or not they deserve to have a voice. Like, it really, to them, it feels like you are invalidating their right to exist.
Okay, so it's not just hyperbole.
Yeah, to them, I mean, it is hyperbolic and it is exaggerated, but to them, the feeling, and I remember it myself too, the feeling of somebody questioning your identity, it strikes to the core of like all of your insecurities. And because you're developing this whole identity as this kind of like desperate bid to validate yourself in this social circle. And then when people outside of it, especially people who you want to be able to trust, like your parents, when they question that, then it just feels like they don't care about how you feel and they don't think you deserve empathy. Like, it's very, when you make being justified to have to be empathized with, and your right to speak, and your goodness in the world, when you make all of those things conditional on the gender identity, when the gender identity is threatened, it therefore threatens all of those other things that are conditional upon the gender identity.
That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
It does make sense.
And since we talk about gender dysphoria a lot here, obviously, on the podcast, how does that fit into this whole schema? Because as I understand it, obviously, now, actually, with a lot of what you just said, it makes perfect sense why people think it's bigoted or transphobic or hateful to suggest that gender dysphoria should be a prerequisite to transitioning, because that, again, is basically saying your feelings don't matter. Your identification is invalid. Was that your experience with it?
Yeah, totally. That's my experience. And I also think gender dysphoria kind of just becomes another mental illness that like is used to kind of like justify and validate. I think that definitely myself, I don't think I experienced actual gender dysphoria. I think that I experienced body image issues. Sorry, my cat. I think that I experienced body image issues colliding with all of these massive incentives to identify as trans. And so I had all these massive incentives. I was looking for any kind of justification or reasoning for why I could call myself trans. And the fact that I really hated my body seemed like that's a pretty good reason. My logic at the time was, oh, I don't actually hate my body because I don't like my thighs or I don't like my arms or anything like that. I hate my body because I was meant to be a boy. And if I transition, then I won't hate my body anymore. So that's the kind of gender dysphoria that I had. But I really don't think it was like it was nothing that the trans identity came before the gender dysphoria. It wasn't the gender dysphoria that led me to consider transition. It was trans identity. And then like 2 years later, I thought about transition.
I honestly think that gender dysphoria is something that's like however you're defining that, it's something that's very easy to kind of convince yourself that it's like it's something that I honestly think would be very could easily result from just obsessive rumination on one's sexed body. It almost seems like gender dysphoria is basically the logical end result of obsessing like that. Yeah.
There's a metaphor,
especially for like, sorry,
that there's a metaphor that Jameson Green uses in his book Becoming a Visible Man, where he just, at the time I thought it was so beautiful and poetic, but he describes the realization of your transness as walking through like a dark cave. I may get some of the details a little bit wrong, but I remember it as sort of walking through a dark cave, having your way lit by one candle at a time, until eventually you have this like grand realization, like, oh, I'm trans. And at the time I remember thinking, yeah, that really speaks to my experience of unpacking this and coming to this realization. But in hindsight, I think what that actually describes is ideological capture. It's a process of being captured by the trans ideology more than it is realizing your true self.
It almost even puts you in mind of tunnel vision, like what he's describing.
Do either of you feel like when you were kind of, in the process of interpreting yourselves as trans and which eventually would lead to transition, do you feel like you looked back and like kind of retroactively changed things that you had been through to kind of like fit that narrative? Like, so for example, like, I don't know, for myself, I would always think that like, oh, if I had a memory about not wanting to wear a dress one day, and my whole life I've never really thought twice about it, I just didn't want to wear a dress that day, I would kind of retroactively interpret that as like, oh, well, I was actually like signaling that I'm trans and I'm not a girl.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
Do either of you feel like you've done that?
Yeah, definitely. Because you kind of look back and you look, when you've decided this is definitely what you want to do and the direction you want to go. I think it's totally natural to kind of look back at your history and basically look for things to kind of build up a foundation that supports where you currently are and what you've currently decided to do. So yeah, I definitely did that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's pretty common to the trans experience of rewriting your history to fit and looking for signs of dysphoria, but also, when, to whatever extent people in their mind try to really believe that they truly are the opposite sex. I don't know how you would do that, because human beings don't change sex. So I don't know how you have, what am I trying to say? Like a really coherent self-identity of the other sex, unless you rewrite all of your history to really believe that you always were the opposite sex. Because otherwise we have this very fractured kind of history and self-concept. And depending on, if you don't want to be out to people and you just want to pass as the opposite sex, you have to go through your history and rewrite it all, because you can't blurt out one day, oh, when I was a little girl, blah, 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 right? So you have to really edit and rewrite all of your stories to fit the narrative that you always were the sex that you present as.
What do you think about that? Because to me, and I'm willing to accept that like people are different than me, but to me, just imagining doing that feels like it would feel like an incredible amount of effort and almost be sad and kind of disrespectful to myself and my journey through life to kind of like go through and rewrite things like that to present a certain version of myself to other people. How do you feel about that, like stealth living like that?
Sometimes it's a safety issue being stealth. Like, I don't think walking through the world kind of announcing that I'm trans everywhere I go would be helpful either, because that would just that creates a whole different kind of social awkwardness. And there are certainly, I don't want to overinflate this idea that trans people are always safe and targets, because I don't think that narrative is true, but there is real hatred and bigotry out there. So it wouldn't be safe in every situation to be out. But it does seem very similar in a lot of ways to when I was a closeted dyke. And, if you're at work and you don't want people to know that you're gay, and you're socializing and telling stories of, everyone's telling stories about their spouses or their kids. There is that similar kind of editing of your story that has to happen in order to remain closeted, and it is absolutely exhausting.
Yeah.
I didn't have too much. I haven't had that much experience with this, just because there was only about, I'd say like 4 years of my life where I was stealth, and I wasn't even entirely stealth, because anybody who looked through my Facebook history for a couple years is going to know the truth of it. And then at the same time, I also never had any like intimate friendships with anybody who didn't know my past. Like as soon as I was kind of getting becoming quite close to somebody, I would disclose that fact. And so it was never anything that yeah, there are certain things that I feel like I've edited even for my own personal interpretation of myself, and I've had to go back and undo that editing just for my own personal understanding of myself and my history. But as far as kind of, yeah, again, my experience of being stealth was quite short-lived and not even all that intense, I guess.
Interesting.
It was stealth light. I don't know.
Yeah. I just remember when I was like, because toward the end of my transition, there was like a short period of time where I was kind of like stealth-ish, like at work, I guess, because I just worked at like a cookie shop. And I mean, I would like, try to, if something came up, let's say I was talking to a customer, something just like friendly banter or whatever, and something would come up like, from my childhood or something, like I had a story, I would edit it. And I just remember always kind of feeling really sad about that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I ask.
Well, it is a kind of self-violence, right? That you're denying and cutting off. I had a very difficult experience when I first, because I was a long time dyke, and that was an important part of my identity for many years, because I transitioned in my 30s. So that's quite a few years. Like I started hanging out at dyke bars when I was 16. So that's quite a few years of identifying one way and then having to dismantle an identity and rebuild another one. Even though there's not much about me that's changed other than my appearance, I'm still the same person. So it wasn't like a complete new persona that I adopted, but it is still grieving the loss of one identity. And I had a really disturbing experience when I first started taking testosterone, and a lot of the lesbians in my life didn't want me in their spaces anymore. So there was that social upheaval and grieving and loss, and being afraid of what does this mean for my future and where will I belong. But the way that played out for me, you mentioned when you started taking testosterone, you ended up in the psych hospital, and I didn't end up in a psych hospital, but for a few days I did have this very disturbing experience that I can only describe as like a sensation of standing over a pool of water, seeing the female version of me drowning in the water and thrashing about and saying, help me, help me. And I remember feeling like I was both being murdered and a murderer, right? Because it was a violence against a part of myself. And
yeah,
it's been really important. And fortunately that episode only lasted a few days, but I sobbed in bed for like 4 days, just having that. And I don't know how to describe it other than, because it wasn't a vision. It wasn't like a psychotic episode. But that was the sensation internally that I had of that I'm killing off a part of myself. And it's been really healthy for me to reclaim that person, right? And integrate that and accept that I am female who masculinized because I had gender dysphoria, and that is my reality and my narrative. And it's been, even though I go throughout my life appearing male and I've integrated into the world as male, that still needs to, I think, internally be my narrative, because I do think that's the most psychologically healthy way to understand it and go about it. Because otherwise I think a person's identity is always going to be kind of fractured and disintegrated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And now I'm able to look back on old photos of myself. Like for many years, I couldn't look at photos of myself prior to transition, and now I'm able to, and I'm able to kind of appreciate that person and care about that person and feel empathy for that person, whereas before I just had to completely block it out.
Yep.
That's really interesting to me, that like you were able to reintegrate that person and accept that person that you had really shut out, but kind of like continue moving forward along the same trajectory. Whereas my experience of, like, I guess, coming back into terms with the person that I had shut out, it required like a complete dismantling of everything that I had done to shut that person out, and coming, like, really viscerally coming back into, I guess, that body that person had inhabited. So that's just I think that's so interesting, like how different people can be.
Mm-hmm.
I think mine was similar to Aaron, what you experienced, because maybe it has to do with the amount of time and the amount of investment that both Aaron and I had in like transition and kind of living as male, that once we realized, that the gender stuff was nonsense, and that transition, whether or not it was a good idea or whether or not it was beneficial, it's still like we are still the person that we were originally, and then just kind of having, this is kind of disjointed, like what Aaron was saying about looking back at old photos and having like a sense of empathy for that person. And like for me, it's almost like a sense of endearment. Like I know I am still that person, but it also feels like there is a cavern of distance there, and so there is some not nostalgia. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but I did also have that time a long time where I couldn't look at old photos of myself because it was, there's no better word or phrase than dysphoria triggering. But now that doesn't exist. And I think it has to do with the fact that I have completely embraced the fact that I am female. I always will be female. I am still that exact same person. I do look different, and my thoughts do work quite differently. Kind of how I view the world and myself is very different than how I remember thinking and feeling back then. And I think testosterone obviously has basically everything to do with that. But I am still the same person, and I don't feel like I have to I don't feel like I have to do anything to kind of reclaim that person, or to because I still am that.
You are that person, just evolved. Kind of to a new form, but it's still like the same person, maybe.
Yeah.
And that like acknowledging that evolution and enjoying that and accepting that evolution doesn't require shutting out the previous form.
Right. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I do feel much more comfortable presenting like this than I did then. Like it did, I did have quite debilitating gender dysphoria that was relieved with transition. And so it's very difficult to regret that and to want to undo it and to re-embrace where I was before, because I was so uncomfortable in such a profound way that I didn't even really understand until I wasn't uncomfortable anymore. And so it's difficult to kind of, to kind of have a nostalgia for that, because I was so deeply uncomfortable. But yeah, so it's a complicated relationship with the past and present, I guess.
Yeah.
That's something I have trouble untangling too. Like, it is the fact that I'm able to integrate that pre-transition self into myself again. Is that because, as you said, that transitioning helped the dysphoria enough that I'm not experiencing that dysphoria, and therefore I'm not triggered by embracing that old self? Or is it just that enough years have passed that my mental health has improved, and could I have gotten here without transitioning? And I'll probably never know, right? Like, how do you know that, right? Because it's like a choose your own adventure game. Like, I chose one path. I have no idea how things would have turned out had I chosen a different path. Ideally, people can get to the sense of integration and comfort without transitioning, but it did help my dysphoria. So
we got deep, guys.
Yeah, we did.
stuff.
I appreciate it though. I really liked hearing about you guys' experiences just now.
Likewise, I really appreciate you coming on and opening up your own story.
Yeah, it's really it's so insightful to kind of understand what like the younger I transitioned in 2010 2011, and so there was it was like I think it was the kickoff of that kind of well, Aaron, you were saying that the kind of political transition has existed for ages, but kind of just like it almost seems like it's been an exponential rise since about the 2011 12 13, and then to where we are now. It sounds like what Helena experienced. Like it's only gotten worse since what you experienced, 5-6 years ago. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Thank you guys. It was a really good conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.